What I'd like to do in these, in the two lectures, is review some of issues associated with measurement of inequality, of intergenerational mobility. Hopefully that'll be brief. Second, I want to describe, and at a very heuristic level, alternative theories of intergenerational mobility. And what I mean by that is that I think if one examines the literature, there are four candidate mechanisms that help one organize the morass of papers that talk about this. And each one of them will have a different idea at the core in terms of what represents the reason why parental socioeconomic status is transmitted, or at least is empirically correlated, and with offspring. And then finally, I want to give you, if there's time, I'll describe a couple of papers that have attempted to parse out the relative empirical salience of alternative theories. If I don't have time for that, I won't feel too guilty about skipping them, because the exercises, as you'll see, have some limitations. Now, in saying that, and as it'll be the case, as you'll see, I'll make some critical comments about various empirical papers. One shouldn't think, of course, about empirical papers. Either they have a value or they don't. In other words, each paper has evidence in it, and the question is, how do you assess it at the end? And part of the art, as it were, of aggregating information across different studies is assessing what you learn from the exercise in light of the issues that can arise in terms of assumptions and the like. So, yes?
Is it possible to adjust the microphone if it's difficult to hear?
Well, that's why I want you to hang on every word. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we aim to please at this business. All right, so let me just make one disciplinary observation, and that is that much work in sociology, in particular the Wisconsin tradition would claim it, in sociology, does not focus on income or wages as the object of interest in intergenerational mobility. In contrast, sociologists have often focused on occupations. And that can mean, you can think about that as one of two ways. One would be, do lawyers beget lawyers? In other words, one could have some vision of a Markov transition process in which the conditional probabilities of offspring occupations are a function of parental occupations. And there, obviously, we would have some notion of skills, connections, and the like that are transmitted from a parent to child, which are associated with details of the parent's occupation. A different approach, which is not meant as a criticism of sociologists' work, but something that's harder for economists to think about, is work that, in essence, takes occupations and translates them into a scalar measure of status, and then one can actually have a somewhat more complicated analysis where it's not simply a Markov chain with states, it's actually a variable that you can think of as a time series. And so those are kind of two perspectives in sociology. I think that if one examines some of the modern work in economic theory on intergenerational mobility, it's actually suggested that occupations ought to get more attention than they indeed do in conventional empirical work. Let me add parenthetically that the Heckman research also speaks to occupations, because once one begins to think about a rich vector of skills that are both cognitive and non-cognitive, it's natural to ask it to embed those, which Sarah Catan, a student graduate a year ago, did in a model in which occupational choice is determined by these skills, and from that you can understand wages. And so I mention that because if we think of non-cognitive and cognitive skills as the transmission mechanism, if agreeableness is an attribute that's being passed on from parent to child, some occupations, there's a high premium for that, computer science, or let's say being a programmer not so high, being a salesperson that's higher. And so I simply want to make the observation that if one wants to take the skills approach that Jim articulated, I think that actually speaks to refocusing at least economists' attentions on occupational measures. All right, but given that I'm an economist, I'm going to talk about intergenerational elasticities of income. So, as was mentioned in the first day, the most common thing to estimate in terms of having a metric for intergenerational mobility is the so-called intergenerational elasticity of income. And by way of background, Something to have to think about is that this is really an issue of dimensionality reduction. And what I mean by that is that I could think about a distribution of incomes among parents, and I could think about the mapping of that distribution to a distribution across offspring. And that mapping obviously could be very complicated. Now, complication's okay. Impenetrability, however, is not. In other words, I said, here are the two distributions. Here's a full characterization of the Markov process describing them. And I said, how do we assess this is a highly mobile society or not? Obviously, that would be a non-starter. And so much of the empirical literature has focused literally on measurement issues, which is the identification of relatively simple statistics that are argued to be good summary measures of the level of mobility. And mobility, of course, is simply the flip of persistence. And part of what I want to do is argue later on that the conventional measure leaves something to be desired. And so, in fact, the empirical literature in economics and intergenerational mobility is remarkably narrow in terms of the methodologies that are used. And what I mean by that is that it is derivative to a substantial extent. I mean, when I say this without exaggeration, and that should have been evident in the Black-Devereaux paper, in analyzing linear regression models, which are no more complicated than saying that I have a model in which, metaphorically, I'm thinking of some cross-section in which I have parent-child pairs, and what I'm doing in the cross-sectional regression is projecting the offspring income on a constant term, the parent's income, and some set of controls. Now, the controls are not chosen in I don't want to say, they aren't chosen in an arbitrary fashion, but they're not really chosen in a principled fashion. And what I mean by that is that there isn't any strong theoretical background or context that says choose these controls versus another. Certain ones would seem to be pretty intuitive. For example, if we're comparing parents and offspring, we want to somehow control for whatever age differences there are. So I'm very proud that I can say that my children all at age 18 had incomes of 0, but there was an important reason for that. They were in college. Okay, and so naturally you need to think about where people are across the life cycle to create some sort of commensurability between the two objects. The other comment I want to make, and this is important, is to recognize that these are not theoretical, i.e. behavioral models. These are statistical models. And what I mean by that is they're simply taking a set of observables and they're engaging in some sort of transformation of the observables into a low-dimensional object called parameters. Now, the reason I harp on that is the error in this model, that epsilon, that is not, in a behavioral sense, unobserved heterogeneity. What it is it's a statistical residual. Now, the reason that you might say, well, is that a distinction without a difference? The answer is actually that one matters. Because when we think about the interpretability with respect to behavioral models of any statistical exercise, that interpretability presupposes some vision of what the unobserved heterogeneity means. And so an outstanding question, naturally, is whether or not the statistical residual maps in a natural fashion to the unobserved heterogeneity that is a matter of a behavioral theory we think is present. And that issue came up in Larry Bloom's talk, and it will come up over and over again. And I think even it was mentioned the first day that, in terms of if you want me to philosophize, good empirical practice is you start off with some view of of observable heterogeneity, a view of unobservable heterogeneity, and the errors in the statistical model in which you instantiate your theory ought to be derivative from the way you've conceptualized the unobserved heterogeneity, as opposed to an ex post tacking on of something, which is unfortunately common empirical practice. All right, now what's this alpha? So the literature focuses on beta. That's the number that people want to report, and that is a measure of the persistence of income across generations. And so if you read papers, they're all, the action, they're all basically, they could have said the paper, rather than call it a paper about intergenerational mobility, they could have a paper about the coefficient beta. Now, and Colin Roberts, who's sitting here, has a nice paper on this. There's an important issue as to what this alpha means. If you ask why are empiricists putting that in the paper, the story they would tell is that if I'm looking at an income of a parent and offspring, that's going to capture something about average growth in the economy. So in other words, if we're thinking about an economy in which there's technological change and the like, we need to account for that in the evolution of income across dynasties. Now, that sounds pretty intuitive, sounds reasonable. Very important question is, why should that be constant across families? And I'll talk about that later. And the reason I raise it now is that's an example in which lack of attention to unobserved heterogeneity can give us misleading results. So I'm going to set x equal to 0 just so we're grounded. I don't want to worry about the control variables. And so just to give you the facts, in the late 80s, late 70s, late 80s, the conventional wisdom was that that beta, and typically the variances of offspring and parental income will be normalized to equal each other, so the regression coefficient is also a correlation, and sometimes it's called the intergenerational correlation of income. The number was around 0.2 and 0.3. Those were the conventional estimates. And that's perceived as a rapid rate of social mobility. And what does that mean? Well, you take 0.2 and you square it, you get a pretty small number. That's 0.04. Do it twice, you get 0.008. And that's why Gary Becker famously said that America's shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. So if you're blue collar, your descendants pretty rapidly will be blue collar too. On the other hand, if you're white collar, they're going to be there also. Now, interestingly, if you ask people, the conventional literature has a very different view of the number, and it's 0.6. So there literally was a tripling of the conventional measure of intergenerational persistence in a sequence of papers over the last 20 or so years. And that's a qualitatively significant change, and it's this type of number that's associated with public, or at least to the extent anything in academics affects public policy discourse, that is associated with claims about this being not a particularly mobile country now. So why did that number shift? Obviously there's 2 reasons you might think that it shifted. One of them is simply it went up. In other words, there wasn't a beta. There was a beta for adults in 1980, and there's another beta for adults in 2013. There's limited evidence that it's increased. Now, limited evidence is not a criticism of the empirical literature. It's merely a statement. You shouldn't be surprised there's limited evidence about intergenerational mobility if we're talking about relatively short epochs such as a decade. And in fact, the literature is not focused on treating the degree of the persistence in socioeconomic status as itself a random variable, as it were, but rather has evolved in trying to improve, and this may not be glamorous, but it's very important, the quality of the data from which beta is estimated. And in fact, the literature itself has very much been focused literally on measurement issues. And so the issue that, again, was mentioned Monday, that just to understand is that's the guts of this literature, is to make the following argument, and that is, and this again speaks a little bit to the occupational question, and that is that if I look at income at a point in time for parents and offspring, suppose they're at the same age, 35, it's not clear that's the object of interest in terms of transmission. And so what we already knew from, and this is Friedman's classical permanent income theory, is that when we conceptualize a point in time income, actually, what you're getting, we would think of it as comprised of various factors, and a richer theory of intergenerational transmission, you would think, would identify how the factors are transmitted across generations. Now, and indeed, that's where I think this literature needs to go. It hasn't gone there. What it has done is it has replicated the logic of the Friedman permanent income hypothesis in terms of the interpretation of consumption. So what do I mean by that somewhat derogatory remark? One vision would say the following, and that is, it's not, income may be a useful summary statistic, but there's the vector of things, of characteristics of a parent, which transmit into influence characteristics of offspring. And those characteristics, not a scalar, can generate something such as income or occupation or whatever education, whatever variable of interest. That would require having a model in which we specify this vector of determinants. And then we would think now about a higher dimensional Markov process that's evolving across time. Okay, that I think would be the ideal. However, what's in fact done is the following, and that is that the thought experiment is to say that when I'm thinking about data, and I stuck in a T there just to represent dynasties, it's not years, so think of them as 25 or 30-year epochs. The thought experiment is to say that the income in a given year is comprised of a component called permanent income and another component called transitory income. Now, I'm sorry, and I left a log out there in that equation, but what the key distinction is the following, and that is that, well, two things. One, transitory and permanent are assumed to be orthogonal, and second, they have different persistence properties. And so the idea of permanent income, in some contexts, actually is a constant. It's kind of your average earning power across your life, or the present discounted value of your wealth claim today, or something like that. In other words, and which would tell you what interest flow you could live off of, whereas transitory income captures luck. Now, is that truly a principal distinction in the sense that I could write down a model and you get this decomposition? The answer is not quite, unless I assume the conclusion. But for our purposes, it's a useful distinction. And so, the canonical story when we talk about consumption would be, if my salary is $1 million, if my income is $1 million because I won the lottery, presumably my consumption behavior is different than if my salary is $1 million, since having a salary of $1 million tells me something about next year's income that the lottery does not, unless I have an in with the people that run it. It can be. There's literature, these papers are not rich enough to deal with that. And so, yes, now, two comments. One, these data are not rich on the time dimension. I've got an observation of parents and an observation of kids. And so I agree with you that that's the best way to think about it. And that's why I said the key difference is that, so I don't want to be too jargony, but the spectral density of permanent income should be concentrated at the low frequencies, whereas transitory income we think of as having a uniform spectral density. That's a very jargony way to say there's a very specific sense in which you would think of one of the processes as being more persistent than the other. Because I only have two observations, whether it's literally constant or not, I can't be addressed. And so the distinction, as I said, has some intuition. It's not actually what mathematically would derive if we wrote down a life cycle model, for the reasons you pointed out, that the object we call permanent income, it isn't that it's constant necessarily, it's simply a low frequency, it's a slow moving object. So to see why this matters, I want to distinguish between the statistical model, where I said, you give me data and I simply project one variable on others, versus, for the sake of argument, I'm not going to defend the model, suppose that the correct behavioral model is that there's an attribute called permanent income of a parent, and that attribute influences the permanent income of the offspring. Other stuff can influence it, but that's actually the mechanism by which transmission is occurring. The reason I wrote that as linear is that when I say something's a mechanism, that's a fancy way of saying it's a behavioral model, and rho is a structural parameter, it's an interpretable object. And that's presumably what we'd like to measure if we're talking about how mobile or immobile a society is. Well, the point is that from the perspective of this regression, if I use actual income as opposed to permanent income as the regressor on each side of that equation, I have measurement error. They're the wrong regressors. Now, classical measurement error, that jargon refers to the idea that the measurement errors are orthogonal to the stuff you care about. Obviously, if I mismeasure the left-hand side variable, that doesn't matter. That just becomes more a residual on the right-hand side. But mismeasuring a regressor can lead to problems. And so the canonical formula for that type of measurement error is that what you can show is that the beta in the statistical model will equal rho multiplied by that ratio. And that ratio has to be less than 1. And so the classical measurement error idea is that in the univariate case, you have an attenuation of the magnitude of the coefficient. So, comment 1, parenthetically, this formula does not generalize to multivariate contexts despite common claims in the empirical literature. This really is a univariate result. Comment 2, this now tells us what the empirical literature must be doing. When I say there's a literature as opposed to a paper, and that is trying to refine the estimates of permanent income that one can construct from observed income. And so now a way to think about the evolution of the literature is the first generation equated permanent income and observed income, and subsequent papers have broken that identity. And so, and this is the sense in which we don't have a satisfactory answer. I don't do these things, so whoever does them can't answer your question with any richness. In essence, what the empirical literature then does, and why it's a literature, is to try to identify data sets, and you won't be shocked to hear the Social Security records as they became available were a very good data set for this, in which you can observe incomes over long epochs for individuals and to average them. And so this is where there actually is a bite to the assumptions. So the idea then is to say, and this is going to be the extreme case, that if I average an individual's income across an epoch, and permanent income is interpreted as a non-varying object, well, it doesn't matter if I average constants, I get a constant. So that's not shifting. In contrast, what's happening in the averages is I'm averaging transitory income, which is modeled as an uncorrelated process, and we have a happy thing called the law of large numbers, but more importantly, the variance of the measurement error in the averaged object is scaling at 1 upon L, which is the number of observations, and so you can get this relatively rapid diminution of the associated bias associated with measurement error. And so the interpretations of the literature has evolved to the statement that by using long records, we ended up with a tripling, as it were, of the degree of persistence. And the argumentation entirely goes through the classical measurement error argument. It doesn't say anything about mechanisms, but it just relies on the classical Friedman distinction between permanent and transitory income. Okay, and so that's an example of why we would think about these differently. To say that my great great grandchildren will have 20. There's a correlation of 20% with my income. That's quite different than saying it's 0.008. Now, in thinking about this regression, I at least want to put it on a table. There's another way to think about it. It's obviously just transforming the regression, just to keep in the back of one's head. And that is that the way the regression is articulated is to say there's a transmission or there's a relationship between the parent's income and the offspring's income. The other thing I could do is look at the relationship between the parent's income and the growth of income between the parent and the offspring. All I did was subtract the parent's income off of both sides. And that's why there's a rho minus 1. So the change in the logs is the growth rate of the income in the dynasty. And rho minus 1 is just a transformation of the mechanism or the coefficient for the persistence. And what that's telling us is what is the relationship between growth and initial income. This has been studied ad nauseum in economic growth literature, because that's what's meant by convergence. In other words, the idea that the richer you are, the less rapidly you grow. And so why is this a useful way to think, or perhaps an interesting way to think? Because if I say to you, I have a rich family and a poor family, and the growth rate of the rich family's income is slower than the growth rate of the poorer family, that says that that the gap between them, so there's some mechanism that's pushing them, other things equal, to diminish across time. And so in the empirical growth literature, this was the claim that per capita differences between, to be blunt, if you want to push the way the literature claims, sub-Saharan Africa and Scandinavia were, as long as that coefficient rho minus 1 was negative, they were transitory, other things equal. In the intergenerational mobility, it's the same idea. Now, the reason I wanted to focus on this is this tells us what rho being bigger or less than 1 is actually quite interesting. Suppose I told you that that rho equaled 1. What would that say? No, just correlation. I'm saying in that equation, if I set rho equal to 1, that would say the changes within a dynasty in permanent income are white noise. Therefore, permanent income itself is a random walk. And therefore, the gap between them would have the following properties. with probability 1, it would hit the origin. So in other words, if one family is richer than another, their descendants eventually are going to crisscross with probability 1. That, I guess, could go all good news. What's the bad news? The expected value of the first passage times infinity. So I brought those up. That's a little bit of a hint as to why this, we might want to think a little harder about how to characterize persistence and the like. In contrast, notice from the perspective of this model, long as rho is less than 1, high or low, eventually any contemporary disparities have to disappear. In contrast, if rho is greater than 1, that would say that we expect the gap to grow. Okay. That's a different thing to think about in these types of models. The screen's disappeared. Well, that screen's disappeared, so I guess I'm going to have to go like this. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the United States. This was a figure you saw yesterday, or saw on Monday. Rebecca, don't worry. If I want, I'll give it without slides if you want. It'll be bad, but I can do it. Okay. So this Blandin paper is on the reading list. The use of it is simply to give you some sense of differences across countries. The canonical wisdom on cross-country comparisons is that the IGE for the United States is relatively high compared to other, that's little L liberal democratic societies. That's the shorthand for Japan, Oceania, Western Europe, Canada, and the US. In other words, if you look at countries that we sort of think about as being, having some general commonality in political and economic institutions, the US looks relatively high. When these types of exercises are extended to broader contexts, somebody in this room has written a paper on the subject, and you see that China has actually has a high intergenerational elasticity, and there's evidence as well that that's growing. Yes. Well, the numbers will be different. I don't think that there's not evidence that I'm aware of that the qualitative message would be particularly different.
I mean, when we talk about income, are we mainly thinking about wages, or are we kind of interested in other types?
No, there are papers that look at wages, and as I said, they're not qualitatively different in these types of conclusions. And then the third thing that was mentioned was this Gatsby curve, that there appears to be a positive relationship between cross-sectional variance and intergenerational persistence. And as was observed, if you write down an AR1 process, the unconditional variance of income is epsilon, is the variance of epsilon divided by 1 minus rho squared, and that immediately gives you a positive relationship. My opinion, which you're not obliged to accept, is that this is an uninteresting fact. And the reason is the following. Intergenerational mobility analysis is conducted at a certain time scale. We're thinking about lives of individuals, and the very notion of what T is here. That's a 30-year gap. In contrast, when we worry about wage inequality, that's a cross-sectional idea that's really functioning at a higher frequency. So if I said to you, can I use the intergenerational regression to understand the effects of globalization on wage inequality, the answer is that you couldn't, outside of a trivial thing, which is to say that the errors are heteroscedastic. And so it happens this period, there was a big shock. It's called globalization. There's another big shock. The variance of educational quality in the United States is different across generations, et cetera. So again, my view is that the graph, even though it's gotten a lot of publicity, is highly misleading because it's taking facets of economic phenomena that function at different time scales and looking for a relationship between them, and that to me, I just don't find it a meaningful exercise. It might be interesting the fact they are correlated, but to have one model to explain both of the crudity of a linear regression, it strikes me as a poor way to think about the problem. Notice by analogy that if this were, can I say macro in front of Caltech students? Okay, good. Private joke. If I said to you that I wanted to explain heterogeneity and growth across countries, I would talk about things like geography, institutions, the usual suspects. If I wanted to understand what's going to happen to unemployment in the United States next year, I wouldn't pull off a growth model and say, aha, the shock is going to have the following effect. I would use something called a business cycle model. So similarly, it seems to me that, since all models, of course, are just approximations, low-dimensional approximations of complicated stuff, that we have to tailor the choice of the model to the time scale you're working at. And so to me, the Gatsby curve is a priori not an object that we should be trying to reconcile with something like a linear regression. I'm not saying there's no I'm not saying that that's all it is. I'm saying the measurement itself is looking at the cross-section today. And the fact that may be correlated with an object called the intergenerational correlation coefficient, I don't think the way to understand that is to write down a model that's designed for 30-year epochs and say, oh, lo and behold, the object that comes out of that has a higher variance when there's more persistence. We have to recognize the two phenomena probably are driven by different mechanisms. That doesn't mean the mechanisms are orthogonal. But it's just, I don't think it's interesting that I can get it simply by working with an AR1 process, because the AR1 process was generated to explain a low frequency or a particular time scale specific phenomenon.
For that, you think that the income of children could also affect the return income of parents?
I think that that's a great point. Of course, you asked an American that, and the answer is, how could that make any sense? Americans don't give a damn about their parents. And I mean that actually only half facetiously. The serious point's the following, and that is when we write down theories of intergenerational transmission, the canonical theories all are one-sided altruism overlapping generations models, the idea that my utility depends on stuff about me and stuff about my offspring. Now, there is a very limited work on two-sided altruism models, and I don't think that but it's not, I don't want to be offensive to the people who've worked in it, but it hasn't taken off as something that caused deep concern, and I think the reason for that is that the context in which these are used to think about mobility are American contexts which have a particular family structure. And so an argument you can see it on YouTube, that I've made in studying intergenerational mobility in China is the American assumptions about preferences may not apply. So if you have a richer kinship structure, it's not clear that the object of interest should be the parent versus the child. It may be an extended family versus a child. So that's one way to articulate your critique. The direct critique is I need to have a richer conception of what preferences mean, and so transfers can go in both directions. And I'm going to argue in a bit, something else may go in both directions that would invalidate an assumption in the Becker-Tomes model. So I think that you've raised an extremely deep issue, which is as we take mathematical models that were developed in particular backgrounds, and so have a lot of assumptions that would look uncontroversial for people from the background, but as we begin to apply them to disparate contexts, I'll pick on China, or not pick on China, but isolate China, there may be limitations of the model. And that to me is, you just brought up when we have to think about. I don't know what the implications would be. I mean, as a statistical statement, if the point is that's why I call it a statistical model. For any set of mechanisms, I can still compute the object. The interpretation of the object then becomes different if we're thinking about environments with two-sided altruism. So that's why I'll keep harping on this. Statistical models are data reductions. Behavioral models are explanations. All right. So to follow this up, very important point is beta, as I said, is not a structural parameter. It is it's the coefficient on a linear projection. Now, why did I go through this thing? Well, if you sort of write down the model in terms of growth, everything depends on whether rho minus 1 is positive, 0, or minus 1, because you actually get qualitatively different behaviors. The answer is because if we think about intergenerational mobility via this linear language, it's actually quite restrictive in terms of the way we might conceptualize something like a poverty trap. So if I said to you, from the vantage point of the linear IgE model, tell me what a poverty trap is, that's not so obvious. And that really is because it is a linear model. So again, I'm talking very heuristically. The way that poverty trap models are constructed, they typically are going to have some phenomenon that says if your income is below a threshold, say, the family dynasty can't escape this from the threshold. In contrast, if you're above it or sufficiently above it, you never end up down there. For that type of phenomenon simply can't happen in a linear model. And so I'm harping on that because it's to tell you that there's something very limiting in the way we would conceptualize persistence or not. I mean, the cheap way to say it is this is somehow averaging, well, it's not a cheap way, it's a true way. This is the beta is implicitly averaging all of the income-specific betas across families. So if I said to you that if your income's below $20,000 a year, it's probability 1 your kids is going to be the same thing. If your family wealth's above, let's $10 billion, that it's your children will never, descendants won't be poor for 100 generations, or they will never be poor. Those are kind of nonlinear statements. Now, since I think in many contexts we're specifically concerned about poverty traps, and so remember when I say trap, that itself I want to be a little precise about. When I write down a mathematical model, I may ask the question, is it possible to get a literal trap? In other words, parents are below an income threshold, the entire dynasty stays below it. When I think about data, it's probably not natural to ask that question because I want to allow for things like unobserved heterogeneity generation by generation. So the literal poverty traps in the theory literature should be interpreted empirically as saying that there's a high probability of being poor if your parents are poor. Okay, and I'll come to that in a second. So, what I want to do is I'm actually going to describe a result from a paper in economic growth. As I mentioned, Colin Roberts has a paper in which he does the following. He says that people are estimating these high, these 0.6, these very high intergenerational coefficients for the United States, but one of the things they're not accounting for is that people actually live in different locations, and per capita income has substantial regional variation. And so what Cullen shows is that one respects that regional variation. In other words, allows the alphas to change. The beta for the United States, the implied estimates are substantially lower. Okay. So what I want to do here is give you just an algebraic example of what's going on. Okay, but I'm going to do it a little differently. So Cullen's point is that the correct model is that alpha itself is a source of heterogeneity at the regional level, and that needs to be accounted for. Here I want to make simply a different comment, and just to sort of illustrate the idea of nonlinearity here. So the questions are following. Let's suppose that I actually wrote down a model of a poverty trap, and there's papers such as Azariadis Drazen's, or very prominent papers in this literature that are now a couple of decades old, or perhaps Galore and Zira and the like. And suppose they had again, I'm making this up just as a thought experiment. Suppose the following were true, and that is that if your family's sufficiently poor, you can't go to school. So I'm telling a story, so therefore the mean for that family is quite low. But once the family's income hits a certain threshold, you go to school, and so in fact that's a different long-run average for the family. So the way that I would construct that is to say that the original regression, the behavioral regression, needs to be rewritten, and there's going to be some constant in the behavioral relationship between parents and offspring. That's secular economic growth. There's a second term that tells me whether the family is in the poverty trap or in this case, affluence trap. So it's the simplest form of heterogeneity, and it's obviously a form of nonlinearity in the transmission mechanism. So if we would sort of want to say something that this is kind of an important thing to know about its presence, wouldn't we? Because after all, I wouldn't want to just take a regression that said, look, beta's really small, everybody has the same alpha, so we can expect rapid diminution of inequality across descendants. What this model says is there's going to be something that's holding the poor descendants back unless you get a particularly fortuitous set of epsilons that kicks you above the threshold. So what happened? So how should I think about the exercise? When I run a regression of income of the offspring on the parent, and I fail to account for this threshold effect, in other words, the presence of what I'm calling the poverty trap, I can do this kind of the standard exercise and ask what will that coefficient equal, and the answer is it will equal the rho, that was the behavioral intergenerational elasticity, plus another term that's the covariances of the alphas, and divided by the variance of the permanent income. So the point of the following is it's entirely possible that I could have a poverty trap in the data, and by failing to account for it, I get a higher rate of intergenerational mobility than if I accounted for it. So what's going on? The way to think about it is, suppose I had some families that are relative to their steady state are very, very far away from it. And then I had some other families that are at the high steady state, they're above the steady state. What will be true? The poor families are going to be growing in income towards their steady state. The rich families will have a decreasing income towards their better steady state. But cross-sectionally, there's a negative correlation between initial income and growth. What's the message? Linear models are a bad way to uncover nonlinearities. They simply don't have, the model I wrote down is a nonlinear structure, and the thought experiment you have to ask is, if I use a linear prism to analyze data generated by a nonlinear mechanism, can I learn interesting things? And so I gave this example tells us that the presence of a poverty trap, it might even be possible, depending on where the initial configuration of countries are relative to their own steady states, that I would have spuriously high mobility. Okay, is everybody with me on this argument?
Yeah. Can I ask you something? So it seems that intergenerational mobility is exogenous to the family's choices or actions. So is it like knowing the objective function of the family or the objective function of the parents? Is it relevant or not?
Absolutely, and this is, again, why I keep calling this a statistical model. And so the empirical literature, I don't want to exaggerate, but overall, the efforts to measure intergenerational mobility, they are theoretical, they're statistical exercises. And so the evolution of the quality of the papers was driven by the length of the observations you had for individuals. You're asking what you're saying? Absolutely. But it hasn't been done yet, except with very few exceptions. So I wanted to say these are the facts. These are how people think about the facts. You brought up issue number one. They aren't thinking behaviorally. And so when you don't have that, the interpretation is going to be questionable. So I wrote down this example. And that would be a perfect thing. Where if I said parents' choices depend on their incomes, that was what I meant when I said you can't go to school if your parents are too poor and need you to work. That's exactly the problem here. But I just wanted to show you, even as a statistical exercise, if there are multiple steady states, I'm just shutting the epsilons off and solving for the model, I could get very high convergence rates and very low degrees by implication of intergenerational persistence. Okay, so the big message is if you think that that these nonlinear things matter, obviously you need to account for them. Okay, that's the bulk of the literature. Let me just briefly say that sometimes Markov chain approaches are taken. There's a slight misunderstanding in the literature that somehow this is a good way to think about nonlinearity. Well, it might be, but what I mean by that is that the Markov chain approach will typically say, I take income, and I assign people to deciles. Your income's in the top 10%, second 10%, so I have a 10 states. So, and then what you do is you compute the transition matrix of the decile of the parent and the decile of the offspring. Now, the point is the following, which is the Markov chain for an AR1 will be dependent on the density of the errors. So there isn't any clean statement that if the world is linear, the Markov chain has the following property. And so I might mention that because you should not think of the Markov chain as a cheap way to deal with nonlinearity. It's simply a different way to think about the modeling as a statistical matter. All right, and so as I said, basically the way that this literature works is you take the individual incomes, you map them into classes. They're typically deciles and the like. You simply construct the elements of the transition matrix. That tells me the probability that I'm in a particular kids in a state given the parents. And there's going to be row sum mobility if I'm looking at relative status, because obviously it has to be the case that everybody, the deciles need to add up. That's a non-trivial point, by the way. If I were thinking about China, would that be interesting? Or would that be an incomplete vision of mobility, do you think, just to calculate the relative rankings? Something's been happening in China the last decade, last couple 15 years, which I think is probably important in thinking about mobility. You know, all I'm saying is that we have a country that's growing 10% a year. It would be an incomplete vision of mobility just to look at the relative rankings of the parents and the kids. A different exercise would have been to take, let's say, 10,000 yuan categories and ask, given if the parent's income is in this interval, what's the probability they're in each of the other intervals? That would give you a very different vision, and that would be one that asks about mobility in a rapidly growing society. Okay. And so all I want you to see is that the literature, by focusing on relative status, I'm going to say, well, mathematically just make some row sum to one, who cares? It actually is important in saying what the question is that you're answering. Okay, now, is one way right or wrong for the U.S. versus China? No, you simply want to ask, in the context of this country, what are the things you wish to uncover? All right, and so here's an example of from a paper by Bowles and Gintis, where they computed this for income deciles, and these are the probabilities put in a nice graph, and so shock of shocks. What you see is particular persistence in low and high deciles. These are the sorts of figures you could generate with this type of exercise. Here's another example due to Bhattacharya and Mazumdar. What they ask is, what is the probability given a parent that an offspring will be in a higher decile than a parent? And so these are the numbers for blacks and whites. And the only thing I want you to see here is that, well, a couple of things. It's not surprising if you're in the bottom 5%. It's very unlikely you will be lower. And you know, the richer you are, the more likely is the kid will be in a lower decile. But the main thing is the gap between blacks and whites. And so what that says is that there's more persistence in the lower deciles for one ethnic group versus another. So I guess I lied. I will draw a picture. What was it? It was the middle one? That No, this is too trivial what I wanted to do. Just go back to it. Yeah, I'm that's
all right?
Yeah. You just want to be sensitive to the following. Suppose that those were deciles for income, not relative income. That's a very persistent Markov chain. That sounds awful, doesn't it? Well, would you prefer this one or this one? That one says it doesn't matter if your parents are rich or poor. Your outcome's always the same. It stinks. Okay. So this is the poorest state. Yeah. No, I said it's absolute. There aren't deciles. These were just the income categories. No, you see, the issue is when they're deciles, I have to have some ability in not just in probabilities, but in the entries. Okay. Why did I bring that up? Because in thinking about difference in black-white mobility, this is a first-order issue. And that is whether or not families who achieve some level of socioeconomic success, be it income, education, and the like, is the transmission, as strong as in the comparable Caucasian or white case? And there's good evidence, I think, that it's not so. And so if you just are thinking about the transmission process, that looks like, oh yeah, so there's more mobility than otherwise. Well, mobility is only good if it's in one direction. And so one wants to be sensitive about that, and that's why this is of interest. Okay, so as I said, even the Markov chain approach is pretty delimited in what it can tell us. One example was that if I focus on relative, that Markov chain is misleading obviously in a rapidly growing economy. Second argument, obviously, is I said, well, I could give you examples where the IGE seems to give strange answers, and in fact would give persistence. If I had countries that were concentrated a lot at different steady states, if I use a linear analysis to evaluate them, I could conclude that there's a convergence for the countries when it's simply not happening. And so let me draw one more picture. The easiest way to think about that. Okay, so if this is family that's not really all I'm saying. Suppose that I had an environment in which there was two steady states. Some of the families are concentrated around one. That's what the epsilons are doing, is moving them back and forth. There's another steady state they're around. If I use a linear model for that, I'll find a negative relationship, given where I chose the parents' incomes, between parental income and growth. But obviously, the mechanism I wrote down is in economic sense, it would be silly to say there's convergence for these families, because they're at different steady states. So how might one proceed to think about these things? Well, one way to interpret the concerns that I'm articulating is a nonlinearity one. In other words, that the language used to measure intergenerational mobility is excessively linear, and it doesn't let us ask questions that we think are important. In other words, when we talk about where ghettos, socially, of enormous concern, that's not a linear statement. There's and in fact, work by Robert Sampson and Stephen Raudenbush is demonstrated that specific neighborhoods that have quote unquote concentrated disadvantage function as quasi-poverty traps. And so it's not just income, it's low income and high non-marital fertility, high absence of males because of incarceration or lack of interest in the children, high drug abuse, etc. These become poverty traps, not in a mechanistic sense, but in the sense that it's hard to get out of them. The criticism isn't just nonlinearity, but it should also be thought of as a lack of attention to the distinction when we're thinking about families and their descendants between converging and having converged. And what I mean by that is if we think about that picture I drew down there, there's some converging going on. But the point is the guts of the model are such that families will never converge. And so we want to have if sort of to push the frontier, if you'll forgive me, on measuring intergenerational mobility, I think we have to begin to think about measures that capture capture different ideas and articulate things like what a poverty trap would mean, et cetera. And then we should analyze the data to say, is there something that is suggestive of poverty trap? And then we proceed to more structural approaches. So one way to think about what we might want to do as a first cut is to say there's a certain income gap between two adults that are contemporaneous in terms of generations. I could ask, well, what's the expected value of the gap of their offspring or their grandchildren, so on and so forth? Well, that would be a natural object to compute. In other words, to say that for each horizon, how does a contemporary disparity translate into a forecast? I focus on expected values because they're kind of the easiest things to calculate, but obviously if you put a gun to my head, I could easily get rid of e's and put mu's there and say we're just computing conditional probability densities. If I wanted to push all the way, I could even ask this question, which is, as I allow the horizon to grow, is it the case that whatever contemporaneous disparity I see, an expected value is going to disappear? Okay. When I ask the question this way, it leads to different ways we would think about the data analysis. In other words, we really want to focus on stochastic processes. They're going to have enough richness in the way that objects at time t map into t plus 1 that we can flesh out whether that there's a long-term gap that we would predict for pairs of families depending on what the incomes are today. So presumably everybody in this room, the long-term forecast of the disparity of your descendants, whatever your disparities are today, is 0. Okay. And the reason for that, there's enough homogeneity in the audience. We'd like to know, is that true regardless of who I start off with? That's a way of articulating poverty trap notions. One way. I'm not defending it as the only way, it's just a way of thinking about it. Here's a different way to think about a poverty trap. I look at a set of individuals. Each one of them has an individual has the feature that the income as an adult is below whatever the poverty level is. I'm not going to worry about the arbitrariness of having a threshold. I could compute another conditional probability. What's the probability that my children, my grandchildren, or however long you want to go, will also be in poverty? Okay, that defines the notion of poverty traps, not in the mechanistic, no chance, you're stuck, but rather begins to capture the sort of conditional probabilities that I think are of public policy significance, which is to understand the permeability of disadvantage amongst parents. And again, this is an object you can compute over different horizons. And for what it's worth, I'm not personally all that excited about taking limits to infinity because, the United States, what do we get? At best, Mayflower descendants are going to be 15 generations. So if you talk about 800 generations, there's equality. I'm not sure there's going to be an Earth, let alone a human race. So the point is that I think that also this refocuses us to ask the questions that are, policies really are meaningful. You have people that are poor today, and we want to know what's going to happen to their kids and perhaps their grandkids. But focusing on the 1 or 2 cohort generation horizon strikes me as where the measurement ought to be. All right, and so these are all just statements about asking whether stochastic yes? The scatter plot, at least the only time I ever did it, which was 20 years ago, it exhibited a U shape. It looked like there's a lot of persistence for the upper and lower tails and less in the middle. Which, by the way, has not been replicated in other studies, but on the other hand, it corresponds closely to my intuitions, which is conditional on being in the middle class. There's a lot of variability, but very poor people, it's not surprising that there's high correlation, and if you're rich enough, your idiot sons can still prosper. But I'm discussing one paper 20 years ago. There has been inadequate attention to rich forms of nonlinearity. But it's changing as we speak. All right. So in terms of the underlying mathematics, if I ask you a question, here's a stochastic process. As I let it evolve all off to infinity, does it depend on initial conditions? That's actually there's many definitions of ergodicity. And one of them is actually to ask that question if you're thinking about dynamic processes. And so that's a thing that one can calculate. Now, I'm not sure that's, and I want to push this a little bit harder now, and that asking questions of that form themselves may not be interesting, so I want to make a proposal for another thing that one might want to measure, which hasn't been done. This is closer to a structural idea. And so let's think about the following, and that is, suppose there's only 2 income states, high and low. And I start off by saying, if the parent has a high income, the offspring has a high income, parent has low income, offspring has low income. Canonical poverty trap. Okay? Now let me modify it slightly. Rather than say that it's probability 1 that your offspring is poor if you're poor, just probability 1 minus delta. And the same for being affluent. And delta can be small. From one perspective, that no matter how small delta is, there's a revolutionary change in the process. The Markov chain 1001 is non-ergodic. In other words, the initial condition never dies out. No matter how small delta is, the initial condition has to die out. Just okay, for those of you that are familiar with Markov processes, there's a unique invariant measure for a Markov chain, finite Markov chain where the states communicate. So if I calculated my long-run poverty trap object, I would get this discontinuity in the properties of the associated conditional probabilities. So that's just an observation, and that's one of the reasons why we don't want to push too hard on non-ergodicity in these types of environments. The second point is, if I said to you, what's the big deal? What would be continuous in going from, well, let's see, what would seem to be smoother, as it were, going from delta equals 0 to small delta? It'd be mean first passage times. So in some sense, 1, 0, 0, 1, the mean first passage times infinity. And with probability 1, you never get there. You know, if I make delta small enough, and this is Larry's evolutionary game theory, where obviously it's a very rich idea there. It takes a hell of a long time to move back and forth, even though the invariant measures may be uniquely defined. So that's something to think about, but what I wanted to push you on is the following. This is where a structural model, behavioral model would help. And that is everybody with me that I could sort of think about a world in which you're trapped, literally trapped, and I just put in a little bit of noise, that delta. Once you put in a little bit of noise, at least the invariant measures have to be the same for all dynasties. Okay. Then this is where I want to do the segue to thinking about theoretical models. And that is that I think that it's important to move beyond the delta is really just adding a shock in a statistical sense. Just as the IgE regression had something called an error that was a statistical object. Once I have a behavioral model, however, I don't have statistical objects that I use in doing the theory. And that's what I meant when I said when we construct a model, what we do is we write down an environment in which the trinity emerges, which is that you specify the preferences, the beliefs, and the constraints each agent faces, and then you have some notion of an equilibrium. That's a description of the system. In doing that exercise, if you follow the rule, which is be explicit at every stage of the exercise as to what represents observable heterogeneity and what represents unobservable heterogeneity, then I will have a model in which the unobservable heterogeneity, which will be instantiated as variables, random variables, is working through the system. Okay. Now, the reason I'm making a big deal about that is I could then ask the question, what if I shut off one source of heterogeneity? I could compute that counterfactual. Okay. Now, why would I find that interesting? And so what I'm saying is we could always think about models in which we shut off certain types of shocks. Now, the reason I think that this is a useful exercise is the following. Suppose I said to you that if there was no heterogeneity in genes, poverty traps existed. But because of heterogeneity in genes, no matter how poor a family is, at some point there's a luck of the draw. Somebody's very, very able, and they, invent something and become a billionaire. That's a very different vision of an economy than, and notice that would be compatible with an environment in which there were severe credit constraints to education. So unless somebody was born in the tail of the ability distribution, the family really would be trapped. And so what I want you to think about is when we write down models in which we have interpretable sources of heterogeneity, I can ask questions such as what would happen if this source isn't present? And so I would personally think it's extremely interesting to know whether or not, in the absence of unusual ability draws, are families really getting trapped in poverty because of credit constraints or what have you. The actual data, of course, that isn't there because genes aren't constant. And so this is why the move to the structural models, in my view, has implications if you go back to the very way we would measure notions of persistence. After all, what's the sort of thought experiment that would be done in a paper on credit constraints in education? You describe the environment, you have an equilibrium model, and then you have a model, and then you ask what happens if this these are the credit constraints. What happens if you switch them off? I'm saying the same thing is true in terms of unobserved heterogeneity. In other words, we want to ask counterfactuals, does this type of heterogeneity, observed or unobserved, does that matter or not? After all, isn't that what, and that's one way to think about the credit constraints exercise. I could ask the question, suppose everybody's rich. What, you know, I leave the credit constraints by changing the observed heterogeneity. I'm arguing here a way to think about getting theory back into these is to ask how we could be able to construct the persistence of income, wages, whatever variable of interest when we use a theoretical model to allow us to construct counterfactuals in which certain types of heterogeneity are absent. Okay. And so the point is, I think the measures themselves, unless you use behavioral models, i.e. use some economic theory, are delimited in how interesting they are. I mean, I hope I've persuaded you that beta is it's not useless, but it's a very crude summary of the information embedded in the intergenerational transmission process. And further, well, okay, so under that, A, without knowing what alpha is, it's not clear that we care about beta. I might allow alpha to increase, or beta to increase if I can make alpha a trillion. The second point is, more generally, that the alpha is compressing all this information that would be associated by things such as poverty traps. That's observation one. Observation two is, the data as we have them represent what we are being calculated are measures of persistence that are conditional on various types of heterogeneity being present in the environment. And the sort of phenomena that I think that we're often interested in is asking, in absence of heterogeneity, let's say in genes, would there be a poverty trap? Just as we ask in absence of a credit constraint, would there be still be a poverty trap or not? And so what I'm putting on the table is here's a different vision of how one might think about the statistics we care about, and that is, under subsets of the heterogeneity that exists, is the system, if you'll forgive me, lack of a better term, self-correcting? It may be that no matter, that the system, nobody gets trapped because there's always an exogenous kick at some point. And kicks can be good if it's an ability kick. A distinct question is whether in the absence of those types of shocks, would the system self-correct? The easiest way to think about it is suppose that I took the model and shut all the heterogeneity off. Would the steady state be unique? Or if the answer were no, but on the other hand, the invariant measures unique with the shocks, then that's an important thing to know, because it says that the shocks are somehow doing something to kill off mechanisms that are built into the actual structure of the economy, which themselves are non-self-correcting. Okay, so this is just a plead, my pleading, that we not reify statistical measures of persistence, and rather, and again, this is not a statement that there's only one way to do econometrics. You have to estimate structural models. It's a statement that there are limits to what these types of data calculations can tell us, and I think that where the frontier ought to be at one level is simply to have notions of nonlinearity and heterogeneity, which is what, and Cullen's doing the latter. But I think beyond that, we need to be able to have a language that focuses away from saying, we see a certain amount of volatility and persistence, but asking whether the mechanisms in the economy, in absence of favorable shocks, is there a self-correcting process by which contemporary disparities are dissipating? Or is it necessary to have these unusual shocks so that we, in fact, ex post see a mobile society? Okay, so that's all cheap talk in the following sense, which is these are proposals I put on the table, and I go through them in the lecture notes in excruciating detail, and I merely put these on the table as research topics. I think that the measurement issues, obviously better data, permanent income, these are first order value, but I think we're actually reaching the limit that we simply need to make the next step, which is to have richer conceptions of what we mean by mobility, lack thereof, and part of it can be corrected through more powerful statistical models. Part of it needs to have theory to guide us in terms of what we compute. And so I am advocating that we look under the light bulb, or under the lamp for the keys, but I'm asking Larry to create one fantastic street lamp so that it illuminates many things. Okay, I wrote these. I actually made a mistake. These were the focus of Larry Bloom's lectures. Let me just make a couple of comments about other statistics that might be of interest. Okay. For thinking about intergenerational mobility, there are different ways to cut the data and sort of say, does this tell us something about mobility? And one of the cuts that might be of interest is not to focus on families, but to focus on groups. So despite a recent Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, which I'm not in agreement with, which is not fair to the authors, I believe the evidence is pretty good that teen fertility is not conducive to the success of either the mother or the offspring. So suppose that you accept that that statement's true. There's some people that have challenged that on the grounds that the unwed teen mothers that have babies or the counterfactuals, they would also do poorly. But leaving aside your stance on that, here's a fact I do think is important, which is if we wanted to understand non-marital fertility in the United States, there is massive heterogeneity across ethnic groups. Now, it's not a moral statement, it's a factual statement. If you want to understand what's going on in terms of the lower tail of distribution, this is presumably something we need to think about. And what's interesting here is the high degree of heterogeneity. The African American number, and I'm sorry I didn't update this table, is now around 70%. That's a very different social structure than a case where you look at upper middle class, white, largely white neighborhoods where the non-marital fertility rate is epsilon. That seems to be something we have to think about. Here's another example. This is not really so much about mobility, but it's an observation about when you cut data by groups, you can see patterns emerge. All right, I guess everybody knows the leading preventable cause of death in the United States by an order of magnitude is cigarette smoking. And that's why the government has spent a fortune studying cigarette smoking, and that's why the Ad Health data set exists. It wasn't to study peer group effects in education. It was to understand adolescent smoking patterns. So here's some numbers from the CDC on teenage smoking behavior, high school smoking behavior. And as you will note, there is a group that simply doesn't smoke compared to the rest of the population, and that's black women. So if you wanted to have a theory of this preventable health behavior, and that's why I'm taking a judgment. It'd be better if people didn't smoke, other things equal. Okay. But I also don't think it's something the government ought to ban. But if I want to discuss that, we'll have to be at a bar. But let me leave that aside. See, the serious point is the following, that if I was talking about cigarette smoking, this is the sort of fact I would like to be able to explain. Now, the reason I put that there is we don't want to have this, again, mechanistic view that disadvantaged parts of the population automatically, every social ill adheres to them. Obviously, African American women are not going to have better educated parents than white women, okay, and so on and so forth. So the fact that a group that on the usual suspects categories would seem to be relatively disadvantaged, in fact, is engaged in what I've paternalistically called the virtuous behavior, that should tell us something. We need to think about groups. Now, in the work that Larry talked about, we have to ultimately think of them as endogenous. So in other words, if I was thinking about residential neighborhoods, that would be a way of understanding why parents affect offspring, but the mechanism would be quite different. The parent, as it were, chooses a social environment in which the child develops. Other things that would matter, what's another hint here? And that is if I was doing an intergenerational mobility regression on smoking, logit regression, what have you, I would have to put in ethnic dummies. Because what I might confuse is an effect that's not transmitted at the level of children, but at some higher social level. And so yes? No, this is tobacco. I have to take the fifth because one of them I haven't actually tried either of them. And yes, I'm telling the truth. Okay. However, my reading is that they are not substitutes. In other words, people smoke for a different reason. By the way, that's not a crazy argument. And furthermore, you could have said, well, does this impinge on, what about non-marital fertility? Maybe pregnant teens don't smoke. You'd have to think about those things. And obviously, these are facts which I find interesting. They are not facts that speak for themselves. In other words, you need structural models to give them deeper interpretations, and we'd have a richer conception of the choices people are making. I really wanted to put these two on the table as examples that if we're thinking about intergenerational mobility, we don't want to just, we want to think obviously about the family as a carrier, or as a transmission mechanism, but part of what families do is they create broader social environments. And in some sense you could say it's trivial because if it's a matter of ethnicity, or in some sense it's self-derivative from choice, and that's just another way to try to understand why you would observe certain persistent patterns of immobility. All right, so that would be one example. Here's a second example, which I actually think economists should study, which there's very little work, which is language. So the thought experiment here is, why is there a dialect of English, which is perfectly comprehensible to somebody who's born here, that we know has first-order negative labor consequences, and yet millions of people use it. That's what Black or African American vernacular English is. Okay, that's a fact. I mean, that is the case. In fact, Jeff Grogger is, has some very nice correlative evidence on this, and there's ethnographic and other studies indicating that in job interviews, if you use AAVE, that can have adverse consequences. Okay, so why would I put that on the table? That's something in which the parents and the community also are associated with the transmission. In fact, this is a rare case where the family conditional in the community, the effect is zero. The fact is the following: the children of immigrants, unless they live in immigrant enclaves, never have the parents' accents. That led Judith Rix Harris to argue parents have no effect on their kids outside of genes. Unfortunately, it was a very bad example for her to choose because there's what's known, the Chomskyan view of language and the so-called language organ, combined with elementary evolutionary arguments, that says that there's something special about how we use language and it can't be extrapolated. But the serious point is this is something which actually matters for socioeconomic outcomes. The parents' role in this is entirely in creating the social environment in which the children function, and that's something I think warrants attention. And sociolinguists have fantastic data sets, so it's not pie in the sky. All right. So the bottom line is, what I wanted you to take out of this discussion is the following, and that is to understand that the empirical literature reduces down to two objects: Markov chains, linear regressions, and Markov chains. That both of those are very limited ways to understand what we mean by mobility, and that we really do need richer conceptions of the transmission process that can't be captured by those two mathematical structures, and that second, it's only by letting theory guide us that I think we can begin to ask new questions, such as whether or not there's a self-correction property in a system, as opposed to whether observed levels of mobilities are a consequence simply of shocks hitting the system. And finally, the other thing I wanted you to see was that if we think about factors that may contribute to inequality or poverty, or in an intergenerational mobility sense, one of the ways that's been discussed thus far is that the family is the carrier, is the transmitter. The family does something, and that, in terms of investment in the kids and the like, and that has consequences. A different view is that the family is influencing the social environment in which the kids develop, and that leads to a different set of theories. You had a question, please?
Yeah, we're probably going to get to this, but in addition to like kind of personal characteristics, over the course of 40 years, so many changes. Like when you're taking a look at demographic groups, you think about like in West the racial ethnic groups were like 40, 50 years ago. They're so different now.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's really special.
Absolutely. And at the beginning, I made an observation that there was limited evidence that the beta itself had drifted up. That's tricky. And so what you're saying, by the way, you just rejected the Gatsby curve. If you think about it, because what you said was that there was a lack of invariance of the parameters that generated it off the AR1. And so the way that what you want to say is that when we're looking at data over epochs, that we need to actually, history matters, and we have to pay attention to that history. And so this example here, the example's made up, but I actually saw it in a book, I'm embarrassed to say 40 years ago. It was a calculation in the 1960s of the occupational transitions of African Americans between white collar, blue collar, and manual labor. And it was a mortifying thing because it basically indicated that the manual state had very high probabilities regardless of the initial conditions. Okay, that's obviously, I wouldn't want to extrapolate that to 2013. Okay, so I fully agree with you, but that's why you brought up what's the dirty word, Keegan, that I don't like to tell students? I'm so frightened I can only write it on the blackboard. It's judgment. In other words, at the end, an empirical exercise is the development of evidence in favor of a proposition. To do a formal statistical analysis obviously implies the existence of invariant objects, something that's meaningful to calculate. So put differently, if I said to you the African American socioeconomic outcomes are generated by a different model every year, there would be no point in doing empirical work unless I could parameterize the models in such a way that is something underlying it that's invariant. Okay, and that's what the judgments are in terms of control variables, accounting for regions, for example, in the African American experience. Is going to matter here in the North in 1950 versus the South in a way that's different from 2013, so on and so forth. Okay, but there's no algorithm for that. Okay, this is why empirical work, in my personal opinion, is harder than theoretical work, because the nature of the judgments that are involved, really requires that one be well read outside of economics. Well, it'd be good for theory also, but without understanding the historical context of the data you're analyzing, that seems to me to be extremely important. And I made that argument earlier with respect to China, that if we're going to make arguments about credit market constraints, I don't see how those can be decoupled from statements about family structure. Yes?
So it seems like for this work can shed light on, say, positive considerations about how income is determined. But in terms of this work, we really need to know the identity of the person in the parents' generation and the person in the children's generation in order to, say, compare a distribution between then and now and say it's better. I don't know if that's entirely clear. But
No, it's very clear, and it's an important point. It's related. The easiest way to think about is the distinction between equality of outcomes and equality of opportunity. In other words, a normative consideration that most people would give assent to is that we have certain ideas about equality of opportunity, and we think a just society instantiates them. There could be disagreements on many issues, such as affirmative action, but I would be very surprised if somebody raised my hand and said, you know what, I think firms should be able to discriminate against African Americans. All right, but the point is, once we ask questions that way, the observed inequality of outcomes, unless you can say something about the mechanisms generating it, we're going to be quite limited in what normative lessons we draw. Exception to that is you could have certain certain welfarist perspectives where I could say, I don't give a damn what happened. I simply want, but in fact, I don't mean to diminish that. I would say that if you said we don't want people to be malnourished in the United States, then it would be the fact of the malnourishment that we address as opposed to the reason why they're malnourished.
which is cross-sectional distribution.
Yes.
Transition.
Yes, and so the issue, when I wrote down the different normative categories on Monday, I want to emphasize, I personally don't think any of them is the right answer. I think they're all the right answer, and that depending on context, some are salient versus others. On the issue of child malnutrition, I'm not sure I really want to go through I don't think I really care what the reason is. I want to rectify it. On something such as affirmative action, that is going to, child malnutrition is cheap because the responsibility issues are gone. Affirmative action is complicated, both because we have to talk about the agency of people at the age of 18, which is not a 0-1. And the second point is that there's other factors that we have to think about. So I think I made the joke that nobody's an advocate of, well, actually it's due to Glenn Lowry, nobody supports affirmative action in marriage. In other words, that sphere of activity we regard as sacrosanct. So rights to privacy, agency, completely trump. Okay? College admissions, there was a reason I mentioned, were you admitted because the admissions committee didn't care and made up something that was nonsense? Was it because you're the best students, or you're the students who should have the highest marginal benefit? You can't answer the affirmative action question unless you've taken a stance on what the objective function is for the institution. So if I'm a public institution like the University of Wisconsin and I'm spending X billion dollars in education, why am I doing it? Is it to reward the best students in the state, assuming Madison's as glorious a campus as I like to think it is, so that's the hardest one to get into? Or should I admit the people who would have the highest marginal benefit from it? The answers to those questions often do not coincide. And so most of the normative things I talked about, I didn't just talk, I talked, besides shocking you that we were talking about something you weren't expecting, one of the lessons to take from that is they aren't operational without the positive facts about inequality. And so rather than call it good or bad inequality, what you want to say is inequality is generated by different forces, and those may matter in how we decide to address it. And so the good-bad distinction on Monday, that had to do with a particular force, and that was asking whether or not it was incentive effects, that these were in other words, that the inequality was a consequence of incentive effects that created some notion of social efficiency. Okay, in other words, that's a mechanism. Okay, other questions? Okay, so we'll take a 15-minute break.